What is a proto-mold?
All kids love log.
'Tis the podcast log
Yes, log.
of the Star Wars Collector's Archive blog. Oh.
Yes, log.
Whenever the Star Wars Collector's Archive publishes a new blog, this podcast will log its contents, interview its writers, and go deeper. It's the Chive Cast Blog Log Pod.
You, sir, are a mouthful.
Relax and just take life easy for a little while. Because it's only lasts for a little while.
All right, Steve.
Okay, Steve, we just recorded for like 20 minutes, but we went off the rails talking about Skype, dating Romanian girls, and everything just got a big mess. We don't do fancy intros to this show. We get straight to the point. Now it's too Gargan Largan. Listen, this is the deal. There's a new article, and it's an awesome article, and it's about proto-molded figures. And I don't know what they are, and I didn't read the article because I want to be a dum-dum who doesn't understand what proto-molds are. And I want Ben Sheehan, the person who wrote the article, and Ron Salvatore, the person who knows everything, to tell us about it, Steve. Okay? So the first question, I just got to ask the right question, Steve. Okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to take one of these proto-mold figures from the actual blog. Okay? It's a picture of the Emperor. I want to go with the Emperor. We were going to B-Wing pilot, but Steve, I didn't like your...
Emperor's better.
I didn't like your answer, so you're being punished. So we've got the Emperor. And it looks like a normal figure. The head comes off, and I want to know why it's special. But in order to know why it's special, Ben, how would this figure feel different from a normal production figure at Kenner? This proto-molded Emperor. And this is Ben Sheehan, Australian Ben Sheehan in America, not in Romania. Hi, Ben. How's it going?
I'm a little disorientated here right now, but that particular figure I can give a bit of insight on because that was actually mine. So that one, the detail is a little rougher, but it's an internally made figure that was produced in Kenner's model shop from, as Ron had said earlier, but we kind of lost in that, from a low yield mold, meaning under less pressure, and it's made cheaply and quickly.
Okay,
and
so when you say internally, you mean like actually in Cincinnati?
Yes, Cincinnati, Ohio, in the Kroger building.
Okay,
yep.
so not like the molds that were in, because most molds, right, would be in Hong Kong or Taiwan or whatever. So these are low yield molds. Now I thought that they were a low yield mold meant they didn't make a lot of things. You're saying they're under lower pressure?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay,
like that's low yield denotes that. Yes. Okay,
so then the Kroger building in Cincinnati, they would have how did they actually make the mold itself? Did they use like the hard copy? Where did they get the thing for that? Do you know that, Ron?
So,
Ben can go ahead. He's the article guy here.
Okay.
I'm not sure I feel comfortable with that. Ron's actually been one of my heroes for a long time on that front. But they tooled that from a hard copy, and that mold, and to be honest, this is one thing I'm not entirely clear on, if those molds were cast, meaning was a figure or a tooling aid placed into molten metal to make that mold, or was it actually done another way? So, the figure pantographed or a duplicating aid cavity created to cut those molds. But yeah, it was done in-house at Kenner, and the purpose being to produce that low yield mold in a way that would produce the figures more quickly than making hard copies.
Okay, Steve, I still don't understand low yield. Do you understand low yield?
Well, so it's interesting that they brought up the pressure thing because, I had always kind of gone under this assumption that low yield meant, only not a huge run, but like a small run of figures, and then the mold wouldn't really be usable much beyond that. But it's good to know that low yield actually denotes the pressure that the figures are injected. So that was news to me. So that's good to know.
Okay. So all right. So then we're in Cincinnati. We've got a hard copy, and then we make this other kind of mold. And then why? Why does this exist?
I think in order to really understand them, you have to understand hard copies. So, a hard copy figure is poured out of silicon molds using resin. And resin is like a 2-part liquid thing. You mix it up, and then you pour it into a silicon mold, and you wait a little while, and it catalyzes, and then you pop out the parts, and they're hard resin. And the resin is usually like a Dynacast, so it's fragile. So if you drop it, it would break.
Okay.
It's also prone to bubbles being in there, right? So the work time for a hard copy figure is pretty extensive. So when someone's making something like that, they're pouring each part individually. It's got bubbles in it. They have to fill it with filler, sand them off, etc. and so forth, put it together, and even then, it's pretty fragile. So, and you generally use a hard copy. One of the things you use it for is to make a production tool to ultimately generate that. But one of the other things you use it for traditionally is using it for a catalog or an industry show like Toy Fair. So you paint these things to stand in for the final product before it's ready, and that's what you use them for. But like I said, there's a lot of effort that goes into it, and then they're fragile. So the proto-molded figure, the thing that it does is that if you can make a cheap, aluminum or Kirksite mold and injection mold it with some sort of plastic, you can knock those things out quicker, and they're not fragile, right? So once you have that mold, you can bang, 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 and you can shoot these things in some kind of plastic, put them together, and then you have samples that you can send around or use for photography, and they're easier to make, and they're not, subject to breakage nearly as easily as the other pieces are. So without understanding the hard copy, I don't know if you can understand the point of the protomold.
Right.
But, like Ben mentioned earlier, developmentally, the protomold figure is a dead end. It doesn't lead to anything else. You're just making it as a stand-in for something during the production process. Like you need a representation of the final product in the middle of the production process. So you bang these things out, and you use those for photographs. And meanwhile, the production process is going on, on a different track behind the scenes. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I like that idea of a dead end. And,
yeah.
And so they would make a fair number of these. And then do we know, I mean, this might be too specific of a question, but do we know like the time it would actually take? Like, did it not take a long time to make the mold, to make the figure compared to a hard copy? I mean, is that a question of like days versus weeks?
Well, I can probably jump in and say that to make a hard copy, you're literally pouring resin into a mold and waiting for it to catalyze. And why you think that might, not take that long, you're looking at an overnight process to make one.
Okay.
And because you're pulling those silicon or room temperature vulcanizing rubber molds off of a hard copy, off of a sculpt to make hard copy, so you're probably going to be dealing with one or maybe a couple of molds, probably most likely one at a guess. And you've got quite a waiting time to generate enough to satisfy every department or canner that would want one. Because as Ron said, it's really the role of a protomold, and initially hard copies before, I guess they came to the idea to turn to protomolds for Star Wars, was to represent the product, and particularly for something like photography. So to make a photo sample of a toy was always a bit of a bottleneck for packaging. So protomolds allowed you to, once you've cut that mold, on that same day that you've got that tool, or you've cut or cast that tool and it's functional, you can churn out 20 of them if you needed them right away. Whereas you're looking at potentially like a 20-day stretch to make that many hard copies, but one person making them. One of the Kenner sculptors actually started in the model shop as a mold maker, and she kind of related this to me and said that, look, really they weren't even that good in the sculpting department, who were the first people to make hard copies. They were not great at doing that, and they were for the longest time trying to farm out that work to other people. But they were forced to do it, I think, right through towards the end of Empire Strikes Back. So that ate up a lot of their time, meaning they couldn't sculpt, but it also was something that was problematic. And as Ron said, air bubbles were a problem, and you might wait overnight and not even have a hard copy at the end of the day because, or at least the part you were molding didn't work.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, as someone who's made, like I used to do a lot of casting and stuff, sometimes, you'll cast some parts and you'll just pop them out of the mold and you'll be like, well, that's not usable. It's got a giant bubble in it or something. So it's a wonky process Whereas shooting those things under some pressure out of a plastic material is going to give you a higher success rate, and you're going to be able to make more of them more quickly. So, it's a step up if you just want to make something for the purpose of representing the product.
Right. So that's awesome. So then they made a fair number of these, but they're still super rare, right? I mean, I don't think I've ever seen one for sale, or at least I haven't been paying attention to it.
I'd say at the top. I mean, if you want to buy, like, say, an action figure prototype, your hard copies are probably, other than sculpts, hard copies are pretty high up there, but protomolds are not far behind. Usually something like that's a really premium piece. They do not come up often. I don't know, maybe Ben might have info on how many tended to be made, but you certainly don't see many that hit the market, that's for sure.
Yeah, that's really a fair point, Ron. Based on what I've been told by people, and by a few people, there really wasn't, at absolute maximum, a dozen of those things that were painted up for any one character, and less as time went on is what I've been led to believe. So in terms of what survived, right. I don't know.
Okay, yeah. So they would make them and give them to different departments, and so then how did any of them end up in collectors' hands? Were they just like people took them home, just like anything else, or?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's just anything else. It's people turn them up. I mean, the first time I recall seeing stuff like that for sale was, I think, Steve's favorite dealer, Intergalactic.
Right. Yeah.
So she had some. This is in the 90s. Steve Sansweet had bought some from her, and of course at the time, this is another thing I guess we have to get into. At the time, they were referred to as hard copies because a lot of the times Kenner folks will not distinguish between a protomold and a painted hard copy. To them, it's this is just a hard copy of the figure.
Right.
So I think Steve bought them as hard copies. I think, and but it was always mysterious. But like you looked at them, I was like, well, these are actually plastic. This is interesting. Like I've seen hard copies that are resin clearly, and yet these are plastic. And then she had some more that she brought out for Celebration 1 in Denver, and I believe pretty much all those were also in that plastic. And it only became apparent what those were, I think, with me and Chris and Todd and Fluffy and Gus, I think, were in Cincinnati, and someone explained, like, oh, well, yeah, we had the ability to make, aluminum, or I think, Kirksite is another material used. We had the ability to make these molds for these things and to make these quickly out of plastic. And it was like, oh, well, there you go. That explains what those pieces are, because they were clearly plastic. Although, originally, I think I blame myself for this, but I think we referred to them as internal first shots, because first shot meaning that was an injection molded piece, and internal meaning it was done at Kenner. But that's really a bad term, because first shot's kind of it's nonsensical, because you're not testing the mold. It's not like a first shot means you're doing a first shot out of the production mold. So we tried to change it to Protomold, which is more accurate, but people still say internal first shot. It drives me crazy. But
do you know who's going to fix that, Ron? Is Ben's article is going to fix that.
Exactly, yeah.
Get everything right about
I'd like to think that, but I don't think that's the case. I think that it's going to confuse people for a long while yet. And
we're going to keep at
even with further to what Ron said about being told that they were hard copies. That happened to me when I bought my first protomolds. They were sold to me as hard copies on eBay. It was a Kenner designer that sold them, and he referred to them as hard copies. And when I got them, I knew right away that they weren't. I kind of felt I knew pretty well what they were when they turned up in Australia. Even though, like, collecting prototypes from Australia is often like, what's in the box, because you've never seen it in person before. But I right away knew that it wasn't a hard copy.
And to tie into the hard copy idea, I think if people listening are really familiar with that, generally speaking, there are exceptions, but hard copies are often, the torso will be cast in like one solid piece of say Dynacast, which is a urethane material, and the limbs and the head will be attached with pins. So it's not like the torso is not in two halves. Oftentimes, the protomolded figures are constructed in the same way. So that torso is just one solid lump of that plastic, right? And then the limbs fit in with pins, which is, of course, way different from a production figure, which has the two injection molded ABS plastic halves of the torso.
I see.
And the limbs are sandwiched in there, right? So the construction of the Protomold is often very similar to a hard copy. So if you're an employee at Kenner and you're not necessarily someone who made these, you're just some guy who ended up with them, hard copy is probably a decent explanation because
just becomes
the use and the construction. Yeah, I mean it's a hard copy, and well, how is this really different from the figure? But for collector purpose, if it's not urethane and actually a hand cast material, we don't consider those hard copies.
Okay, so Steve, I have a Skye-ish point. Should I inject it here?
I don't know why you even ask. You gotta just
So it's kind of a weird sort of Freudian thing, but I used to remember whenever I'd go out to dinner with my mom, she'd wear like a slip underneath her dress, and she'd always say, "Is my slip showing?" And I remember like not really knowing what it meant and understanding something to do with underwear and sort of weird Freudian, probably, proto-sexual feelings and everything. And when I look at these Protomold figures, it's like their slips aren't showing. Like you don't see the torso line. Like, so that does make them really interesting because like on all production figures you always see how it's made,
That parting line,
yeah. You see the parting line. You
can't believe you sexualize parting lines. That's really disturbing. Now.
Only
here.
Do
you have any photos of your mom?
only here.
But it's not just sexualized. It's actually like fully Freud, because it's like a weird thing, like.
Yeah.
You guys.
They're weird pieces. There's no doubt. I think that's why collectors like them. Or I know like Brock Walker is really into protomolded figures. But I mean, when you hold one, it's clearly you're in a different world from a production figure. It's like this is different. And also, production figures typically the limbs are PVC and the head is PVC and the torso is ABS plastic. So there's a different quality. A lot of protomolds is just all the same material from top to bottom. Yeah. So it's brittle. The whole thing is like stiff and brittle, and you're just when you hold it, it's like this is not normal. This is a similar feeling to a hard copy, where it's like you're in a whole different world.
Well, it's like what Ben I think describes. It's like a rough facsimile, right? It's not a hard copy. It's like a refined,
almost like a bootleg.
Right.
The B-wing pilot, for example. I mean, the B-wing pilot has hand carbonite arms.
Right.
And and the head on that figure is made of like rubber, and I mean really soft PVC rubber. What Ron said is like that's been my experience as well. But every so often you'll get one that's just got some really wacky composition in terms of like
well,
just
true.
the materials
There's no
used.
rules with these things either, right? Like as long as they can pop them out and they look okay, like you're good, right? So there's. I have seen some oddball things, so I guess it doesn't surprise me to hear that the head of that one is PVC. And I didn't even realize those arms were Han. You said Han Trenchcoat? Is that what you said?
Well, a couple of them. So go ahead.
Yeah, that was exactly right. Yeah.
And so, okay, a couple simple questions. So they were hand painted then, right?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so they're hand painted probably by the same people who made it. Then how like what's the sort of like generalized difference in so then if they're painted they look rougher, they don't look quite as like precise, they look weird, there's just less details because it's not machine.
They're painted with I think it's with flash vinyl paint, like so it's a really matte type paint generally, and and depending on how once the plastic or once the low yield plastic shot has come out of the mold and been pieced together, if they're not treated properly after that and they're painted, the paint doesn't stick really well, so you see some that show up where there's almost no paint stuck to them at all. But I mean they just have that really distinctive almost, I don't want to use the term bootleg and pretend it's accurate, but they have this kind of, it looks like what it should look like but just doesn't quite look the same. And there's a size differential too. They can be a little bit smaller than a production figure because the mold, the way those figures are shot under less pressure, there's not really any care given to the amount of shrinkage in the mold. So invariably that wound up churning out figures that are a little smaller than production figures.
Right.
Yeah. I think also too, remember that a production figure, you're doing that out of a production tool that has had quite a bit of work has gone into that thing, right? So there's polishing and some tweaking and everything to get that thing looking just right, to get those figures to come out looking like something you'd buy in a store. Whereas that's not the case with this. It's basically a one-shot deal. They make that relatively cheap tool or cheap mold, and then they're stamping out figures, and there's just imperfections. I mean, in the Ben's blog post, you can see that Emperor. I mean, it looks okay. I mean, you could maybe put it in a catalog photo, and it would look all right, but it's not jumping out at you as a beautiful thing. It's not. The surface is basically probably pretty rough, and then the matte paint kind of adds to that. So it looks, I don't know what the word is, a little primitive maybe compared to a production figure.
Yeah. Right. Now, hey, Steve.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Should I get into another Freudian point?
Okay.
So in his 1999,
is this going to have something to do with your parents' underwear again?
No, it's not. So in his 1919 essay, Das Unheimliche, Sigmund Freud developed the concept of the uncanny, but in German it actually means like the unhomelike. So like it's like things that feel similar but are a little bit off. So I think that these things, based on what you're describing, because I've never held one of these, has an unheimlich feeling.
Yeah,
where like
that's accurate.
Like I just keep looking at this Hammerhead and the Hammerhead Protomold, and it's like it's similar, except his slip isn't showing, and it's like the paint's a little bit different, it's a little bit rougher, and it's in that sort of uncanny feeling.
I'd just like to point out that as far as like recognizing things that are a little bit off, it takes one to know one, Skye.
Yes.
You're actually just recognizing one of your kind there.
Yes. But some of them are unpainted, is that right?
Well, I've got a Rebel Commando that's pictured there. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, not many, but that one that Ben posted there, that Rebel Commando, is certainly a cool thing. So you don't see that many of those. And there's also in Ben's piece, there's two pictures of Greedo and Hammerhead, which turned up. And I guess we should tackle that. But those pieces are different, than other proto-molded items that have turned up, but they've been lumped in with that. And I think see that Hammerhead
maybe we
there.
should just make people. Maybe people should go to the article about that. I think people should have to read about that because I don't, because I'm getting overwhelmed, and if I'm getting overwhelmed, then the rest of our dum-dums in the audience are getting overwhelmed.
I guess it's just that's kind of a good example of a curveball item, and I think that also ties into the I guess sort of unfortunate controversy that Ben's post generated on Facebook groups, which is that there, people, it's a little bit vague on what, I don't know if necessarily the Cantina creatures are protomolds in the same sense that Emperor is a protomold. I think they're a little bit different, and I think there's also a set of the first 12 figures which maybe were made out of molds that were production molds but were not yet ready for prime time, that folks have claimed as protomolds, but I don't know if those, despite the claims, I don't know if they're exactly what we would consider a protomold in the traditional sense. So there's a weird vague line there that people are constantly debating on what where it begins and where it ends.
Well, with all the later stuff, like by the time you get to the Jedi figures, it seems pretty clear exactly.
Yeah,
in terms of like categorizing those earlier figures from the earlier lines is where things get kind of difficult to suss out.
I think so. I think I would agree with Chris Tergulius's post in some of those Facebook threads that some of the things being claimed as protomolds now are not clearly different than what we have understood them to be. That B-wing pilot is 100% a protomold, what we would have always understood one to be, and some of those other things, maybe there's a better word for what those are. Protomold, what's that?
Yeah, well, personally, like from my experience talking to people in tooling from Canada, was that when your production molds are being trialed, you test them every so often, and you're pulling a 3D injection model representation of the figure out of those molds. And I think those first 12, because you can follow detail on some of them through to production figures, when we talked about a dead end, molding process for a protomold, because it really is only designed to be that kind of quick fix to getting a 3D product representation to into the hands of the right people. That I think it's a fair bet that if you can follow, changes in those first 12 figures we're talking about through to production, that it kind of indicates they've come out of a mold that was destined for a production mold that's being refined in the background.
Right. So
I think that makes a lot of sense to me. Yeah.
We should probably just kind of simplify this debate. So the debate is whether or not there are proto-molded figures of the first 12, and there are prototypes that some claim are and some are not. And the main reason to say that they are not is that they were most likely not made from dead-end molds.
Yes. Yeah, that would be correct.
I did it, Steve. That was like 8 pages of fighting back and forth between two friends of the podcast.
Regardless of what we say is not necessarily going to clear it up in everyone's mind. But, I mean, I think that's kind of what the debate is between, what you're an early mold that's in the process of being tinkered with, if that is the case, versus something that was made purely to shoot a certain number of samples out of that never went anywhere beyond that. And
right.
I think there's a super clear line between the Emperor and, say, a Han Solo first shot from the first 12, regardless of how early that first shot seems to be.
Mm-hmm.
There's a less clear line between, say, the hammerheads featured in this piece and those figures. So there is a bit of fudge factor. I've always been somewhat skeptical about what those Cantina creatures are. We were told when we bought them, the painted hammerhead you see there. I got a hammerhead. A Greedo was found years ago, and the other creatures as well, Walrus Man and Snaggletooth. They were described as being protomolds, but they are quite a bit different from, say, that B-wing pilot. So they have their torsos are in 2 pieces and such. So I mean, I don't.
Yeah.
There is a bit of fudge factor there, but when you get into the Empire and Jedi stuff, it's much more clear cut, I think.
Hey, Steve. Can I talk about Freud and the fudge factor, or?
I don't know if we dare go that far.
Because he thought that some people, when they were younger, had a sort of an explosive fudge factor, and then others had sort of a retentive fudge factor. Okay, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Ben.
No, I was just going to say, I think the first really clear-cut example of protomold is the Rocket Fett protomold on the archive.
Ooh.
I kind of look at those Cantina creature figures, and what the first thing that kind of leaps out of me about them is that they are almost an identical or a carbon copy of some of the first shot pieces to come out of the Clash of Titans line that Mattel did, and it looks to me like the torso of those figures is a production mold type shot, where it probably, if you look inside those things, it would have the same same connectors as you would see in a production figure. But I think the Rocket Fett protomold, I mean, without having held that in my hand to look at, that always struck me as looking like a protomold should. I mean, even if the limbs aren't.
My memory of it is that it was,
Yeah, and that I think is the appearance of something. Once you're used to seeing it, and I'm blessed to have seen a lot of protomolds, I think that you really recognize that line of delineation between what is and what isn't when you see a lot of them, and that's just only by virtue of being blessed to have seen a lot of them. It's not wisdom or anything like that. It's maybe just a bit of experience looking at them.
Yeah, with all this stuff, it's like once you've seen, when you've seen a lot, collecting in general, not even just Star Wars stuff, but it's like once you've seen a ton of things, like you start to really get a feel, like, what is a legit action figure sculpt and what isn't. It's hard to make a call unless you've really seen dozens of them. Same goes for hard copies and same goes for protomolds. Like, I think once you really get a feel for it, it's like, oh yeah, well, this is what this is. Whereas, I mean, most collectors, I totally get it. Like, I think a lot of collectors, especially ones who aren't really versed in prototype collecting, is just kind of like, wait, what? I don't really understand.
Yeah.
And frankly, I've had collectors to my house, and I've put one in their hand and tried to explain, and they still sort of don't get it. I was like, well, you're holding this, Klaatu skiff, and it's obviously heavier with a big one-piece torso with this different material. It's like, how can you not recognize this is not a production figure? But it's still a little bit vague. It all depends. A lot of experience in investigating these things helps you
Yeah.
Right. Awesome. Well, listen, this I think is just the right amount of information, Steve, because I feel like I know what a protomold is now. And
Good.
And I want to go read the article on the SWCA.com. I mean, blog.theswca.com.
There's also a good point, I think, too, to be made, is that remember that, say, 8D8 and EV99 were not sculpted at 1-to-1 scale, so those were 2-to-1. So any sort of 1-to-1 prototype of those figures would have almost had to be a proto-molded figure. Like a hard copy that was directly made from a silicon mold would be at the 2-to-1 scale, at the same scale as the sculpt. But a proto-mold, you could probably pantograph down, right, to, a quick mold and make some injection molded samples. So you're never going to find a 1-to-1 scale, a 3¾ inch 8D8 hard copy. It's always going to be a proto-mold. So I think that's another important point to make for some of those figures.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, just to Skye, sorry, just really quickly, this is take a second.
Yeah.
Just to your point about understanding protomolds, the fact that Kenner people will sell you them and tell you they're a hard copy, it really kind of lends itself to the idea that you can't be really faulted for not understanding the difference, because if the people that work for the company that made them didn't even get that, as a collector, it's a bit hard to get your head around.
Yes. Well, then
there's no doubt.
Well, I really appreciate it. What I'm going to do is the first attempt at recording this episode, I asked Ben what a protomold was, and he gave a beautiful answer, but it was way too advanced. It reminded me of Yehuda in an Australian accent, except 100% accuracy.
Oh, no, Yehuda, I'm not sure Yehuda falls into the advanced category sometimes, but Ben's answer was really very good. You should maybe paste it later on, so,
Yeah, that's how I'm going to do it, right? I'm going to do it. This is the last thing. The outro is going to be just that thing. I might even do it twice, so you can listen to it, because he goes into a lot more detail, and it's really fun, because I can't wait to hear it, because I'll actually understand, the majority of the words. I'm
really glad that Ben wrote it up, because I think it's a good piece, and I think it helps people understand it. And even the controversy is good in a way, because it gets people talking, and hopefully people are respectful and polite, even if they get their tempers flared a little bit. But I think it's a good piece that people can take a look at, and even if they want to disagree with it, that's fine. I think it's pretty much on point, but hopefully people go and read it.
And that's part of the great thing about this blog that's now 5 years old, is it's really fulfilling the function that the archive has fulfilled for 25 years. We gave a speech up there, Ron, Steve, and I, about the value of the archive, and it's really right here in this kind of essay. And with the blog, getting Ben in there and having it added, it really adds a lot. So
and even disagreement is and debate is at least not from all perspectives, but is pretty helpful from time to time. People can learn as they go through the different opinions and whatnot. So
yeah, all right, Steve. I think we'll be able to get this under 35 minutes. So this is a real blog log pod. Are you feeling good? Yeah. Do you think we're ready to say goodbye to everybody?
I think given the shaky start, I think we're in pretty good shape.
Oh my God, I love this episode, Steve.
Thank you guys both for coming on.
Thanks for coming on, Ben. I hope we get some more blog stuff from Ben, because his stuff is always really good, I think.
Yes. Well, thank you. I feel awfully flattered by that, but I just want to thank you guys for having me on here and letting me contribute to the blog. It's that's kind of a bit of a dream for me, as nerdy and geeky as that might sound, because the archive was, I grew up, my collecting grew up with the archive, so it's a bit of a kick. I get a bit of a kick out of that to contribute.
I'm just going to hit stop here and then insert Ben's awesome overview. So okay, all right. So, and actually, before I do that, he sent us a message. Ben sent us a message mentioning that he sort of. There's so many terms here. It's very difficult that he sort of misspoke at a certain point during this podcast or during this upcoming overview. So I just want to say these things to clarify. I'm going to read directly from his message. And you're wondering, am I going to try an Australian accent? No, I'm not going to. I'm just going to read it. I don't go for silly accents. Ben says, crap, I just realized I should have mentioned that Kirksite is a proprietary blend of zinc and aluminum, not lead. And also I should have addressed that the rocket fet that I referenced is not from a card back. The protomold was on store display. Well, 2 store displays. He apologizes and does not want to introduce any further error there. Precision without my Australian accent, which oddly ends up going into Liam Neeson impersonation. I don't know how that happens. Okay, here's Ben's fantastic, weird, long overview of the Protomold process.
Well, like I kind of came to the idea of writing the article after your podcast where you kind of touched on it. I realized a few of the questions that people had never really been answered. I didn't feel, at least not outside maybe, a conversation or that type of thing, but also because it's generally confused a lot of people when they see these figures that tend to be molded in, non-production colors, or they maybe have a different composition of PVC, and they try and fit them in the box of what a first shot is, and they come up with the idea that since there's some molding differences, they're actually protomolds. And I think that really stems from the idea that a protomold, to follow that line of thought, they think a protomold might mean that the figure comes from a mold. It's not a production mold. And that isn't necessarily the case, given a production mold is refined over a period of time. And so you can get different shots out of it as they're trialing it that might look like, for all intents and purposes, then they're not leading towards a production figure when in fact they are. And the distinction really between a protomold and a figure that's coming from a production mold is that the protomold is coming from a mold that's pretty much a dead end unto itself, and it's been done in a way that's cheap and fast, and it has there's some material distinctions to a protomold that you don't really see replicated anywhere else. In that it tends to be that milky white color. You get often limbs and the torso and head in that same milky white color. But also there's other things, like if you look inside those figures, I don't think you're going to see anything that reflects production processes of joining two torso halves together, for example. And also you're looking at less detail, not more, because when you're making a rapid prototype mold, you want to be producing that as quickly as possible, and part of that involves polishing that mold out with kind of within an inch of its life. And without wanting to ramble on too long here, you're looking at something that can be polished that way to make the mold functional, and you can remove detail without it really being a problem. And so in addition to it being cast probably or cut a little more roughly, it's also going to be treated differently at the point you're refining it to make it a working mold.
I think Ben gave you kind of like the advanced course description. I mean, I think the For Dummies description is